The NY Upstate chapter of the APA will be your host for this session. Before we get started, I would like to thank our conference sponsor, Hodgson and Russ, for sponsoring this session, Zoning for E-Mobility. Without our partners, this virtual conference would not be possible. We want to let you know that all of our sessions are being recorded and will be available online through the conference page in the NY Upstate chapter's YouTube channel. Links will be provided on the Eventbrite page as videos become available and are posted. So the CM credit information and the relevant links should be in the chat. All attendees will be automatically muted. If you have questions, please submit them in the Q&A. Please submit them in the chat, and during the Q&A session, we will get to them. As I said before, the CM credit number is 922-1234. That information is in the chat box. The link to the conference page on the APA website is also in the chat. For attendees seeking planning and zoning board credit, you will receive an email confirming your attendance and the session's eligibility for planning and zoning board member training credits 24 hours after the event. Viewing webinar recordings are also eligible for CM credits and may be eligible for planning and zoning board member credit. Planning and zoning board members should check with their municipality to confirm eligibility. Today, I would like to introduce our speakers from the renewable energy practice at Hodgson and Russ. Our first speaker is Daniel Spitzer, and our next speaker will be Ms. Raquel Parks. I'd like to welcome them and thank them for taking the time to attend. Why don't you guys take it away? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here today. See if we can get this thing to behave. There we go. And there we go. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon. I'm Dan Spitzer, as Danny mentioned, from the firm of Hodgson Russ, along with my colleague Raquel Parks. We are members of the renewable energy practice. Hodgson Russ, for those of you who are not familiar with us, is a Buffalo-based upstate New York law firm with offices from Toronto to Florida. And we've been serving many of the communities in upstate for a very long time. We've been around since 1817. We've been involved with renewable energy since long before it was called renewable energy. We have worked with many of you on projects both for you and with many developers. So we're hopeful to share particular information today about the electric vehicles and how you can make them work in your communities. And it's partly to understand that everything you do is, as you know, as planners, and often are trying to convince your boards, is integrated into the other work that you do, much like our energy practices. And I hope we have an opportunity to work on projects in the future. In terms of this zoning, though, for e-mobility, this is extraordinarily important for those of us who don't believe that the climate change is a hoax, which apparently some people still believe. Of course, there's also some people who believe that the virus is still a hoax. Nevertheless, transportation is responsible for total greenhouse gases, 29% of total greenhouse gas emissions. And that is the largest sector of the economy in terms of the source of greenhouse gas emissions. And it's a lot easier to address transportation than certain other sections, such as buildings and some of the industries that are significant producers. More importantly, perhaps, internal combustion engines are significant sources of pollutants that cause health issues, and particularly for asthma for young children, and they aggravate diseases. They cause damage to lung tissue. Motor vehicle pollution contributes to the formation of acid rain. This is a very significant problem. And although the focus with e-mobility is often on greenhouse gas emission reduction, the reality is we're talking about making our health better. Even if we were to not change the sources of the fuel of our power industry, and New York already has a very low carbon power industry, you would be significantly reducing the pollution by moving away from ICEs, internal combustion engine cars. Also, we're going to talk today about e-bikes, e-scooters, and other micro-mobility vehicle services. And strongly related to the rezoning is the permitting of those facilities. Raquel is going to give you a very specific case study that shows how to do it and problems that were learned and some ideas that you should put in places as you think about shared ride services. Really important part of addressing the transportation issue is providing alternatives to cars. And all of this has become more important. As of a new law, starting in 2035, New York requires all cars to be zero emissions. Now, we're going to talk today about both zero emission cars and hybrid cars. Theoretically, the law phases out hybrid cars as well, all emissions producing cars, all tailpipe emissions. So this is important, and it's what planners do. We lead. And this is an opportunity to lead in a critically important area. It's becoming more and more evident that we need to deal with electric cars in terms of understanding them. They're becoming more of our society. And while in certain areas they haven't been accepted as well, New York is doing pretty well. And some of the infrastructure that we're talking about is starting to get built out. And we want to talk about some very basic things. We're going to talk about two kinds of EVs, basically. So there's the true battery electric vehicles, which run solely on batteries. And there's the PHEVs, which are the hybrids that contain both electric motors and gasoline engines, and will, when the battery is depleted, switch over to a gasoline engine. The terms electric vehicles, as they're defined, generally cover both. We're also going to talk about charging systems. And it's obviously, you don't go to a gas station and fuel up. You don't have just stick the fuel pump into your car and away you go. The EVs take a while. And so zoners and planners have the opportunity to create charging opportunity that actually can provide a boost to your local community by providing opportunities to use the time, then you're not doing anything else with your car. Most cars are idle. I believe the last statistic I saw, most cars are idle 96% of the time. So there's lots of opportunity to be charging up the cars. And there's lots of things that you can do with your car. You can even, in some cases, in some states now, if you've got a car that you're not going to be using for a while, your charger at home will automatically sell the energy that's part of the energy that's in your car back onto the grid and help you make some money. And of course, it does that at the more expensive time. So if you charge overnight, sell back to the grid during the peak times, you can actually help reduce the cost of the EV charging. So important to understand, it's a very different animal in terms of the fueling, and that is going to drive a lot of our discussion. So as we start, we always start with all things that are well done in terms of the planning world, is you should start with your comprehensive plan. The plan should identify both general and specific goals. Comprehensive plans can set the tone for all your future electrification projects. A number of communities have done specific green plans, and in terms of how their municipal purchases are going to be changed, how they want housing to be affected, how they want to promote charging within their community. The plan can identify specific cost-effective sites that can increase the value to EV drivers, looking, like we said, for the dwell time, 2 to 4 hours, like outside of workplaces, outside of coffee shops, if you will, or restaurants. Looking for 240 volt power near parking spaces, easily accessible. We want 24-hour access. Larger parking lots obviously become the easiest place to put these in if the electricity is there and the electrical infrastructure. We want to locate them, if we can, along major roadways to bring, to encourage those who travel longer distances to switch over to EVs. We want them to be lit at night so that they're safe. We want them to be protected from harsh environmental conditions. And all of this comes from a NYSERDA EV program. There's lots of resources online about EVs, and NYSERDA in particular, and its Charge New York has significant resources. So an example of both the specific and the general is from the City of New Rochelle plan. Right in the plan, they talk about a key concept: encourage sustainable transportation. They want to explore both ride sharing, but they also want to explore the strategic infrastructure investments. And they're looking ahead here. They're not just talking about electric charging stations. They're talking about hydrogen powered buses, fuel cell buses, which are just now starting to become available, just now starting to become viable. Still takes a lot of subsidies. New York State is putting together a program to encourage electric school buses. This is a city that's looking ahead. So they've put something, a specific plant concept. We want to encourage sustainable transportation. That, as you all know, as planners, is what you want to do in a plan, but as zoners, if you will, it also is the kind of thing when you're adding conditions like thou shalt do this to your project. One of the reasons you can add a condition is because your comprehensive plan calls for things like encouraging sustainable transportation. We want to, so again, the specifics: expand the supply of electrical vehicle charging stations and alternative fueling stations to support and encourage the use. So they take it from the general to specific and give true direction. Let's talk about your code a bit and the kind of things that you may want to put on your code. As you know, a good code has basic definitions that get you to the points where you can write your specific regulations the best possible. We do 4 things with our codes. We allow, we regulate, I'm going to forget the other 2, we incentivize, and I forgot the 4th one, my apologies. But your codes do all of these things, and we're going to talk about all of them, but it starts with the definition. So I've given you 2 examples of definition. Some codes only really want to look at the future. They only deal with battery electric vehicles that require solely on batteries. Other codes, more common, is the inclusive EV, which includes plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. And that means that you could still have fossil fuel using vehicles within your community because PHEVs still do use fossil fuels. Another definition is the definition of, in this case, in the town of, I believe it's Otto, uses the electronic vehicle charging station, and then specifically talks about all the other names for it: EV charging station, electric charging point, but basically defines it as the infrastructure that supplies the energy to electric vehicles. Important to get those in place in order to set up your regulatory structure. When you're talking about charging equipment, it's important to understand we have 3 levels that are commonly accepted for defining such equipment. Level 1 is considered the slow charging and operates, basically on 120 volt typical type of system. Level 2 is the most common. This is what we're starting to see in houses. We're talking about 240 volt AC here. The level 2 is something we're going to talk about in a little bit. There are communities that are requiring houses to include level 2. So the question is, are you allowed to do that? Always an interesting issue in terms of authority in New York. Level 3 is what the industry is moving towards and what, of course, we want in our commercial areas, if we can, along the highways. These are the fast or rapid charging, operating much higher, obviously take a greater expenditure of infrastructure. And the level 3 stations are often called rapid charging stations. The growth in these, which the state is now starting to spend considerable money on to encourage through subsidies, through its utilities, are very important aspects of the charging equipment. So it's important that you define them. And the reason it becomes important is some codes allow the equipment everywhere. We want it everywhere. Other codes are more selective. So this from the town of Brutus that I've put here is permitted locations. And you see that they allow level 1 and level 2 charging stations are permitted in every zoning district. Level 1, you can just put in. Level 2, you have to get a building permit for. Very simple system. Level 3, though, or fast charging, you can see they've limited those to commercial and industrial districts. And they require a special use permit to go into the residential, certain agricultural, riverfront, or special development districts. So they're encouraging them in the where you're more likely to see heavy vehicles. They're encouraging them without as of right uses in certain districts, but they're requiring a special use permit. And you all know what special use permits is. Okay, is it right in this particular location? And there's still concerns about the safety of charging equipment. The electrical codes have gotten much better. There's specific provisions that are required in state law for you to file when putting in charging equipment. Anything that gets a subsidy from NYSERDA has to go through licensed installers who they've checked out. So generally, that's why some entities don't simply permit them everywhere, but have a level 3 just in limited, particularly commercial areas. So here's an example in detail. This is from the City of Atlanta's code. They specifically define the charging equipment as an accessory use in structure. And they talk here about devices for the generation of energy, such as solar panels, wind generators, and other devices such as the EV stations are, and you can see they specifically talk about level 1, level 2, or fast charge are allowed as accessory uses. They then go on to talk about where things are allowed, which are their districts, and they talk about the DC fast charging allowed as a permitted accessory use in the following districts, whereas the 1 or 2 are allowed in all districts. So there you have a very complex code, a lot of different zones, and they've made definitive decisions about where they want the DC fast chargings and where they want to encourage them everywhere. So let's talk about some additional provisions that you might want to think about. And the Town of Brutus Code is a real good one. They've gone on to really specify, here's what we want to see, and here's some of the rules that we want to put in. So they have a section of their code on design standards. They, by the way, split their charging stations between those available for public use and those available for restricted use, such as residential ones. And that's important when we get to the point where we talk about incentivizing EVs. Public use is obviously everybody can use, but we're also trying to encourage the residential growth, but we need the public ones so that people can leave their homes and still charge. If all we had is the restricted ones, we're simply not going to have the kind of electric vehicle adaptation that we need, adoption, excuse me. So in the Town of Brutus Code, they talk about some basics about the parking spaces, some basics about the requirements of the specific National Electrical Code. They talk about some of the other things. They also, and by the way, one of the reasons I put this section in, they put in here the specific section of the National Electric Code, Article 625. My own preference is to say installation shall meet the requirements of the National Electric Code, period. Because as we all know, things change. And you want to make sure that you're citing to the most recent without having to change your code each time. And the electric codes change constantly. Just a note, and this is by no means a criticism, because this is Town of Brutus Code dealing with electric vehicles is one of the best in the state, very thorough. Look how they've dealt in letter D with the curbing and really try to make, some specific rules to guide developers along. We had a question about, I saw in the chat about level 3 chargers and do they incur utility charges? So let's talk about cost generally. Generally, there are tariffs that are established by the Public Service Commission that set all the utility charging rates. If you're at a utility, and if you're a company that installs this equipment and then charges the public, you pay the utility tariff plus a fee on top. City charge is one of the larger ones. If you have a home system, you pay a tariff based on the electrical system that's involved. There has been a lot of action by the Public Service Commission to create specific tariffs. And in the past year, they adopted specific tariffs related to EV charging. There's been a tug of war between the utilities and the industry, no surprise there, over the revenues and the amounts of the revenues. Utilities strongly favor electric charging systems. Understand that. The utilities are in a world where they recognize that energy efficiency and reduced energy consumption and reduced generation at large plants, with the favoritism instead going towards the distributed energy, is the wave of the future. So electric charging cars is an extraordinary revenue opportunity for them. And so they have tariffs that establish it. But in answer to the question, yes, there's a utility charge If you get it directly, there's if you get it through a service, you're paying that service, which includes the utility charge. Okay. Moving on, let's talk about encouraging EVs, and this is where you can all really shine. And here's some examples. So the International Code Council, the folks who give us all these codes, is recommending adopting codes to require new builds to have a 240 volt so that it can handle level 2 charge. In other words, every home built in your community must be EV level 2 charging ready. And the question comes up, can a new municipality require new builds to construct that charging infrastructure to include it? Can you pass a rule? And there's a lot of discussion going on in this area. We have communities in California that are banning new gas hookups. We have communities in New York that are thinking about it. And we always run into this issue of what can a municipality do? Because generally in New York, you can only do what the legislature has allowed you to do. And you can feel free to grimace about that because we all know how brilliant the legislature is. But the reality is that in New York law, you have the rights that are explicitly giving you, the rights that are implicitly giving you, and those necessary to carry things out. So you're explicitly given the power to make sure that buildings are safe. Therefore, you can have a building permit system as an implicit way of carrying that out. And you can charge fees in order to afford that system. It all builds into from the authority to monitor safe buildings. Well, can you require houses to be equipped with chargers? The authority, there's no specific code section that says yes, but state law terminates sales of non-EVs in 2035. So it implicitly is supporting authority to require chargers in homes. You have the right to act under your police powers and under your zoning powers for the public health and safety. It's clearly publicly more healthy, if you will, to drive an EV as opposed to an ICE car. So I think that you can make the case, and the courts will accept the case, that a law that dictates that new subdivisions will be equipped with the electrical infrastructure for EVs and that homes are required them is an acceptable path forward. This is from the town of Otto, talking about how to do permit streamlining. They basically sort of accepted EVSEs from other permitting, required a 2-day turnaround. So Otto is a rural community south of Buffalo, and they're basically encouraging the installation of these systems by making it as easy as possible. And they put right in their code, by the way, cars that are not charging are banned from spaces, and enforcement of that becomes an interesting issue as to people parking in non-charging spaces, in charging spaces. Encouraging EVs in multifamily. Forbes did an article recently. They talked about how 85% of EV charging goes on at home, but multifamily sites where 80 million Americans currently live don't really have access. So you, as the zoners, can solve that problem. You can require multifamily residential land uses to include electric charging. These are some examples from St. Louis, Minnesota, on how they've done, and I believe somebody asked, and I'll confirm, but the slides are certainly going to be available afterward for all the text of these things. But here's some ways of specifically requiring multifamily residential land uses have 10% required parking as level 1 stations and 1 level 2 station for guest parking. The guests don't stay as long, so they charge faster. Even 1 handicapped access parking space is going to have access. So the town is basically saying, thou shalt do this. Another way is to encourage it, and this is fairly common, and I urge you, if you have not done this in communities, to consider doing it, mandating these facilities for new developments. So Montgomery County has a minimum number for all developments with 50 parking spaces. Howard County, and also in Maryland, did it just for residential units. In Middletown, Connecticut, they talked about any new development requiring 25 or more parking spaces shall have that minimum and must have level 2 or 3 charging station per EV space. So they're requiring the higher level charging in that regard. It's good examples that can be found on the net of how to do this. Also want to strongly encourage you, if you don't already use incentive zoning as a tool, here's an outstanding tool for promoting EV infrastructure. If you basically say, if you create the system of incentive zoning and you have as one of your available amenities to be provided public charging stations. So budgets are tight. You want to put EV systems in a park. A developer wants a density bonus, or perhaps some extra reduced frontage is required to pull their development together. Here's a way where the public can get specific benefits in the form of the charging stations paid for by the developer. And what you usually do is that you bring in a vendor. You can do this through RFP, or else otherwise, if it's on public line through RFP, the vendor then owns and operates the station, but the capital cost is absorbed through the incentive zoning methodology. Somebody writes that they've seen a number of communities allow install EV charging facilities without any mention of these facilities in the zoning code. Is there any downside to this? And the answer is no, except we've run into some situations where codes say if we don't allow it, it's prohibited. And so the codes aren't necessarily clear if they're accessory equipment. And so we have run into some situations where building inspectors have sent people to zoning boards because they weren't sure because it wasn't mentioned. So if you take the view that it's an allowed accessory use, and therefore certainly, and particularly within a residence at chargers, I'm not aware of anybody who gives people a hard time with charges within their home. If you take the view that it's allowed, then there's no difference. But if you want to end any doubt, particularly on the commercial side, the larger charges in public areas or in private areas, including it as an allowable accessory use solves that problem. Does the New York requirement that all vehicles be zero emission apply to farm equipment tractors? I don't believe so. It's a great question. Maybe I'll get a chance to look it up while Raquel's talking in a moment here. But I believe we usually exempt farm equipment, but I don't know off the top of my head. But that's a great question. I'll try to find out the answer for you. I'm going to finish up by, let's see here, as soon as the slide moves. What I'm going to do now is turn this over to Raquel and talk about the e-mobility revolution. We now have a situation in New York where, somewhat late, New York has legalized e-bikes and e-scooters, and we are starting to see vendors come in and provide these services. And e-bikes and e-scooters are a significant way of reducing certain car trips and enhancing mobility of those who don't have cars. There's significant possibilities of serving environmental justice communities. They really are an opportunity, but there can be problems with them, and you have great authority to regulate them, including banning them if you decide it's not right for you or not right in certain areas. I strongly encourage you to look at the micromobility laws and to take the control of this into your own hands. I'm going to turn it over to Raquel now to talk about a case study in San Diego, as well as other aspects of shared rides.
Thank you, Dan. Let me just start sharing my screen. Oops. Apologize, it's taken me a few minutes to get the proper setup here. So sorry to give you that. Okay, can everyone see this? Can I get a thumbs up? Make sure before I start moving on. Excellent. So I thought this case study in San Diego is a helpful way to see how a city enacts regulations for micro-mobility vehicles. In particular, San Diego was a little slow to implement these regulations, so they had a myriad of problems at first, but then developed solutions through regulations. So initially, the city of San Diego wanted to just partner with a single company for bike sharing. And so they agreed to partner with DecoBike, and they had signed a 10-year agreement with them. And DecoBike are e-bikes that are stationed in large solar-powered corrals. So as you can see in this image, they do take up a good amount of space on a street. And they did enjoy exclusivity in San Diego as being the sole bike sharing company, and they had installed 97 stations around the city. So prior to the city enacting regulations, companies did not realize that they were able to enter the market and compete with DecoBike, other micro mobility companies. But in early 2018, the city of San Diego, the city attorney issued a memo that had confirmed that the contract between DecoBike and the city did not prohibit other bike sharing micromobility companies to enter the market. And this actually attracted a host of dockless micromobility companies, since these types of vehicles took up less space and you'd be able to increase the amount of those. So as you can see in these couple images here, there are the dockless bikes, and also now the e-scooters were becoming a popular choice. So this situation, the city did a carrot before the stick approach. Initially, the city did not impose any regulations on these micro mobility share companies that came in, and they were nowhere near prepared for the increase of these micro mobility vehicles. They did have a plan to expand and add bikeways through the city to accommodate an increase such as these types of vehicles. But the city did not make sufficient progress on this plan before the flood of micro mobility vehicles entered the market. Just to give you an idea, there was this regional bike plan early action program, and from 2013 to 2021, only 12 miles out of the 77 total miles of bikeways were complete, and 13 are under construction still, and 31.5 are nearing construction. So there were a host of issues that popped up with these vehicles once additional companies entered the market, and it created a lot of public safety concerns around the city. There was improper usage of the vehicles, which led to speeding and accidents in high density pedestrian traffic areas. In particular, there were 44 collisions in 2018 with these types of vehicles. 13 resulted in serious injury. The e-scooters were an even bigger issue because helmets were optional for adults 18 and older. So those accidents were more severe. There was head trauma, all sorts of issues there. There was also sidewalk and public right-of-way obstructions with this increase of dockless vehicles, and this resulted in lawsuits against the city from disability advocates over the vehicles blocking wheelchair access, and also injuries resulting from people tripping over the vehicles in the public right-of-ways. There was also all sorts of illegal parking issues and vandalism. They were finding different vehicles in dumpsters, trees, and fountains. This just gives you an idea of, prior to the city regulating these types of vehicles, what it looks like. While on the right, the vehicles are set up in a neat fashion. As you can see, they're still greatly blocking a large piece of the sidewalk. So this was an issue that citizens of San Diego were constantly dealing with. So the city focused more on regulating these vehicles through permitting, but they did amend the vehicle and traffic section of their municipal code. And they determined regulations and a permitting process that would create incentives to hold companies accountable for their actions and try to weed out bad actors. The permits would be issued by the city manager. They made sure to limit the amount of permits to companies. They would be only issued twice a year and only valid for 6 months. And upon expiration of the permits, they would need to be renewed at the city manager's discretion. The companies were also required to submit a performance bond or other type of security They also imposed labeling requirements on the micro-mobility vehicles themselves. This would state something like riding on sidewalks is prohibited in at least 40-point font. And if applicable, a minimum age requirement would be listed on the vehicles as well. And they did also require the companies to agree to indemnification. So there were also permit fees, and this included a non-refundable fee for each micro-mobility device within the company's fleet that were used on city property. This estimated about $5,000, plus there would be the additional $150 per micro-mobility device. And the companies were setting their own limits on the fleet size, but that did require the city manager's approval. So that could be controlled through the city. The city also provided an incentive that would be a reduction in the per device fee if the company adopts a program approved by the city manager that would increase ridership opportunities to low-income individuals. So the city considered areas that were having the most accidents and overflow of vehicles, and they shaped their regulations around that, which did lead them to various restrictions. And they determined that the biggest problem areas were boardwalks, downtown areas, beaches, and near bays. So when they developed these new regulations, they determined 3 tiers essentially of restrictions for the vehicles. The first tier was the strongest. It was outright prohibition of operating micromobility vehicles in certain areas. The second tier, they prevented parking and locking of micromobility vehicles in certain areas. And the third was just limiting the speed of micromobility vehicles in certain areas using geofencing technology, which I will discuss a little later what exactly that is. So one provision of the municipal code that the city amended would prohibit the use of motorized transportation devices on boardwalks. And they specified this to different areas within the city. So for example, public walkways in Mission Beach, Coronado, Pacific Beach, and La Jolla. Within this provision, they also defined what motorized transportation devices were included for this prohibition, and that was shared mobility devices, electric bicycles, motorized and motorized scooters. This provision also laid out the specific locations, and one example is they would say beginning at South Mission Beach, Jetty, North Ward to the terminus of the public walkway at Ocean Boulevard, Outlaw Street, and Pacific Beach. And if you do look at this provision, they lay out quite a few additional descriptions as well for limiting the particular locations. So that the second tier of restrictions, they determined other dense, high traffic and pedestrian areas where they didn't want to prohibit the use of micro mobility vehicles, but they did want to restrict the ability to park and lock the vehicles. So in particular, there was one area they would say within 40 feet of another shared mobility device on a city sidewalk or other property located in the beach impact area in the parking impact overlay zone. The city identified this was a dense area, and so this was the attempts to try to declutter this already congested area without actually prohibiting the use of vehicles. There was also another area, so they would not be able to park or lock the bikes or display them on a city sidewalk located in the downtown community plan area. They also determined that they would not they would prevent the parking and locking within disabled persons parking zones, within 500 feet of a hospital, and within 500 feet of schools, or within 6 feet of any direction of any sign marking a bus stop or trolley stop. And so the last tier of restrictions that they imposed related to just reducing the speed of the vehicles in certain areas. So this was going to be done through the geofencing technology, where an operator would be required to reduce the speed of the motorized vehicles to 8 miles per hour or less. And they defined certain locations for that. They also did a separate restriction, speed limit restriction of 3 miles per hour in particular areas that were densely populated and highly congested, such as Martin Luther King Promenade and the Embarcadero. So I mentioned this idea of geofencing technology, and this is a unique tool that municipalities should be taking advantage of more. This is the creation of a virtual geographic boundary defined by GPS, RFID, other type of technology like that, which does enable the operator to regulate speed, issue notifications, take other actions when a shared mobility device in its fleet enters or leaves an area. So when the scooters enter or the bikes enter a designated area, as the city has provided within their code, then the devices are controlled and the speed is automatically decreased within that area. So this is a really helpful tool that can be used to limit the speed limits here. And the city determined that this would be a condition of the permit and required the operators to use this particular geofencing technology. So takeaways from this case study, local municipalities should take a balanced approach when it comes to regulating micromobility vehicles, but this also should include a robust permitting process. And they should ensure that these regulations are in place before the companies enter the market, just to make sure there's not a scramble to impose these regulations, and it will prevent issues later, as this case study shows. Consider the impacts that micromobility vehicles will have in various zones, such as a parking impact overlay zone, and restrict accordingly. San Diego took an interesting approach with this by laying out various levels of restrictions based on how densely populated or busy certain areas are, especially during tourist season. You can also consider additional tools to implement to ensure public safety for all riders and pedestrians on the street. One example is complete streets, which Dan will be addressing shortly. And municipalities should have sufficient regulation to minimize accidents and prevent obstructions on public right-of-ways, but not too much to constrict the market or stifle innovation. So these are just some additional shared ride services, best practices. I am trying to be cognizant of time, so I'm just going to go through them a little quickly, since quite a few were already mentioned throughout that case study. These types of services should only be allowed to operate on the right-of-ways with legal permission of local governments, since they are able to regulate these types of services. And it is helpful for companies to designate who's responsible for fielding complaints or addressing technical difficulties, or coordinating the removal of scooters that are parked illegally and providing public education. Specifically, San Diego had a Get It Done app where residents were able to report scooters and bikes that were parked illegally. And then the companies would have 3 hours to come out, obtain those vehicles, and put them back in their proper place. Otherwise, the local police were able to impound the vehicles, and this resulted in thousands of impounded vehicles. So this was a very helpful tool for them. And the city can also reserve the rights to terminate permits at any time, limit the number of companies operating, number of vehicles, and prohibit companies from operating certain right-of-ways based on their conduct. Also, limiting the time period of licenses is helpful, 6 to 12 months, as an example. The contracts developed as a result of competitive bid processes may have a longer duration, which can be helpful. And the contract should reserve the right to update permit terms over time. The city should require that operators provide written notice at least 14 days before ceasing operations if they are no longer able or willing to provide service in the city. And I'm going to give it back to Dan to finish off with complete streets.
Thank you, Raquel. I think I have an answer to our farm equipment question. So I looked up the actual law, which, by the way, is a goal that they shall create regulations doing it. It's not an outright prohibition within the law itself, but rather it's a requirement to the DEC to create regulations getting down to zero sales of non-zero emission cars. So the law calls for passenger cars and trucks offered for sale in the state to be zero emissions by 2035. Medium duty and heavy duty vehicles offered for sale, zero emissions by 2045. And then a further goal of zero emissions off-road vehicles and equipment by 2035. So there's no definitions. So we don't know whether or not tractors per se are part of the equipment that is referred to within the statute. And the statute itself is a mandate to the Department of Environmental Conservation to create regulations bringing this into force. So I don't know that we're going to have a definitive answer on farm equipment in terms of whether it's considered to be the equipment mentioned until we see those regulations. We also had a couple of questions about some of the stuff that Raquel's just gone over. If I'll just try to cover those quickly. Real good question about, can you renew permits at the discretion of a city manager? Does that subject you to accusations of arbitrariness? The reality of some permits is that you can't always go back to the board every time, and you don't have to. When you delegate the authority to renew to an administrative official, you have to set out standards. You have to meet due process requirements. You cannot, you try to limit the arbitrariness. The person who asked that question inquired whether or not you potentially were opening yourself up to legal challenge if the decision on renewals was left to the city manager or other administrative employee as opposed to the legislative body. And the answer is absolutely. But the reality is that any decision, even if it's made by a legislative body, is also subject to that same principle. I would think about it in the same way that planners think about special use permits. The law on special use permits is that when they expire, unless there has been significant violations or significant changes otherwise, the renewal is generally required. It's arbitrary and capricious not to renew. It's not a de novo review of the permit application or renewal. It's more of, have you been a good boy or girl? And if so, you get the permit renewal. So I look at it the same way, and I think a properly written code would not encounter a due process violation. But I certainly don't disagree, particularly in our litigious state, that a denial of a permit renewal should be well documented, well thought out, because litigation, particularly of a license, is likely. Another one that I don't know if Raquel, if you know the answer to this, I do very little with the Americans in Disability Act, but we have a question of, does the ADA apply to limitations municipalities are placing on the use of these mobility devices? I would think that the answer is that it depends on what the limitation is, but potentially yes. If you have devices that prevent people from getting to certain places or other limitations, that there can be situations where if they're not reasonable accommodations, not reasonable regulations, you could be subject to ADA violations. I mean, companies are getting sued all the time because their websites are not ADA compliant. So certainly restrictions on mobility devices. A lot of the rules that are put in place are actually to enhance pedestrian and wheelchair mobility by ensuring that these devices don't interfere with that mobility. But I do think it is a potential possibility. let's see. Gary Plomo, how are you, Gary? You asked if the code doesn't specifically call out EV charging, wouldn't it be an accessory use in most instances? Again, you've got to look at the language of the particular code, Gary. If it says that, if it says specifically that something's banned unless approved, the better source is to list it in there. But generally, I think most communities are viewing these as accessory uses. It's one of those things that's also becoming common. Some years ago, probably about 30 years ago, there was a case in New York at the appellate level that said a skateboard ramp in a backyard was not an accessory use because it wasn't common. About 10 years later, another appellate court looked at it and said, yeah, skateboard ramps are very common. So they're just, they meet the accessory use definition. And I think you're right, Gary, that's most of these will fit into that. I don't see any other questions at the moment. So let's talk about complete streets to finish this out. For those of you not familiar with complete streets, I think of them as the revenge of the pedestrian. It's time to make pedestrians and other uses to have fair rights to the street. I've seen some statistics where if you take all the parking spaces in the U.S., it basically is the same size as the state of Connecticut. The amount that's of our public space that is contributed to cars is overwhelming. And the idea of complete streets is to give equal purpose to other uses besides just vehicles. And frankly, in the pandemic, where a lot of traffic went down, we saw some really novel and really courageous actions by cities and communities to reclaim streets, New York City in particular, with reclaiming parking lanes and other areas for outdoor dining. And some of that has stayed on and hopefully will become permanent. In Buffalo, where I live, the complete streets has led to a rebuild of a lot of the downtown streets, eliminating turning lanes, providing more room for pedestrians, providing more room for other transportation. I'm praying they're going to pave those streets before the winter hits because they're a mess right now, but it's looking good, and the changes. Go ahead to the next slide, please, Raquel. So the idea of complete streets are streets designed to enable safe access for all users, including e-bikes and e-scooters. And the design of complete streets is going to vary depending on your community. And obviously your professional planners, you know how to deal with that. But the design should include sidewalks, wide plate shoulders, bump outs, or what I was just mentioning are being built in the city of Buffalo, eliminating turn lanes. But these curb extensions slow down traffic. They provide safer crossing opportunities for pedestrians, special transit lanes such as bike lanes or bus lanes, lane striping that's careful. One of the things I've noticed in New York City, where they've done a great job of adding bike lanes, you're now more likely to get killed by a bicycle, in my opinion, than by a car at a lot of intersections. The intersection right in front of our New York office is a fairly safe intersection. It's very easy to cross safely, but you got to watch out for the delivery services because they don't follow the rules. So it's kind of interesting how an effort to enhance different forms of transportation have led to some interesting compliance requirements and some safety requirements. And now that we have e-bikes and e-scooters all over, it's going to get interesting. The rules of the road apply to everyone. And law enforcement is going to have to write some tickets, just like they do with cars, I think, to get the bikes and all to comply. But it is a great opportunity. And this can save money on future transportation retrofits with infrastructure design and to enhance pedestrian safety and reduce congestion, provide more efficient travel. Complete streets have been a pretty good success. Next slide, please, Raquel. So we have in New York the Complete Streets Act, which requires state, county, and local agencies to convenience of all users when developing transportation projects. The NYSDOT in particular, but also local agencies that are implementing this law applies to any project undertaken by NYSDOT. So if you're a local and you're only using local town money, let's say, for a project, the law doesn't technically apply to you, but it does apply to any project undertaken by NYSDOT that receive both federal and state funding subject to their oversight. But it's up to you in the community, local municipalities, to adopt the complete streets for locally funded projects. And there's over a current currently over 100 local municipalities and counties that have passed resolutions supporting that. And it's a good move forward. I think we have one more slide that just gives some examples. The city of Buffalo incorporated its complete streets into its planning. As I mentioned, the projects are moving forward. The Department of Public Works has authority to include pedestrian and bicycle facilities and new street facilities in the parks. It's really, in my opinion, and there's others on the webinar who are from this area, but I think it certainly has worked in terms of achieving greater pedestrian safety. And lastly, we've got a couple of pictures of some of the way complete streets work. So that concludes our presentation. I think 4 minutes early. So Danny, I think we got a couple more questions that I've gotten loaded up. One person has suggested that I erred to use public parks as a default example of where to place charging stations. It might be suitable in some cases. It should not be the first choice. This is not the purpose of public parks, and missing in a use such as this may not be appropriate. You're absolutely right. It may not be appropriate. It should be up to the community where to put them as appropriate. I can tell you that around the country, many communities are encouraging the use of the installation of EV systems at parks and at tourist attractions to attract EV tourists. And they are advertising, hey, if you come stay with us, if you come see our attractions, we've got EV chargers for you. So you Tesla owners, who frankly tend to be higher income individuals, please come to our community. So it fits into your individual strategy. Public parks is one aspect of where it can be appropriate. It may not be in other places. You can also do incentive zoning where you say to the developer, we want to have electric buses for our school. Please provide the school district with the direct charge, the rapid charging system. Also perfectly appropriate. So it depends on your specific community as to what's appropriate. But you're right, it shouldn't be by any means just intended to say public park should be the default choice. The idea was, though, let's get public access as opposed to restricted access charging. How about a city that has snow? Well, I'm sitting in my son's house in Houston, Texas, and Raquel is visiting her parents this week in San Diego. But I do live in Buffalo, and we do occasionally have snow. And there are a lot of communities in the northern climes that have very successful adaptation of micromobility devices. In particular, if you look at some of the things we're doing, the Nordic countries are absolutely leading the charge in terms of banning cars. If you look at Oslo, Norway, they have banned all cars from their central district. They've recaptured the parking spaces for other uses. Other communities as well. Denmark, which has the highest density of bike paths, has, I can tell you personally, they get snow, and it does not preclude them from moving forward with these. So while snow certainly is an issue that has to be accommodated within a traffic plan, it nevertheless can be accommodated within micromobility. And obviously electric cars work just as well in the snow as internal combustion cars. Let's see, level, I think we've got everything, Danny. Did we miss
we have
anything?
one last question. It's from Dean Shea. He asks, what traffic calming measures can be used to keep road traffic from passing left-turning vehicles on the shoulder so pedestrians and bicyclers and e-scooters won't be run over?
Tasers, it comes to mind. Beyond that, there are methods that can be put in, but they're expensive. You got to put in bollards or other separations. I mean, the only way to truly protect micro devices, of course, micromobility, is separate lanes that are separated from traffic. So you certainly education, enforcement by law enforcement. If in New York, you're not supposed to drive on the right-hand side of a solid white line. I don't know of anybody who's ever gotten a ticket for doing that. But technically, when we all get to traffic lights and we drive to the right to go around the person making a left turn, we're violating New York vehicle and traffic law. So enforcement was one thing, but separation, the only physical thing I can think of, and I'll defer to Raquel if you can think of anything, but other than physically separating the lanes, it's a very good question, because we certainly have a lot of the rise of micromobility devices has led, of course, to unfortunate interaction with cars.
We have a couple of good other questions which I can copy and send to you both. And it is 1 o'clock, so I want to be cognizant of everybody's time. I wanted to thank you, Daniel, and you, Raquel, for taking the time to present this very interesting material to us, and for the attendees for taking the time out of their day to attend the NY Upstate APA and the New York Planning Federation joint virtual conference. Our next session is one that I'm really excited about. It's going to feature the research and work of our planning students, and that will be at 2 p.m. The title is Best of the Next Generation Upstate Planning Students in Their Communities. If you cycle up through the chat, you should be able to find the CM credit information. So for those of you who need CM credits, and please be sure to contact the New York Upstate chapter for if you're a planning or zoning board member to get continuing education credits. So I will, as I said, I'll send those 2 questions that we didn't get to the presenters so that they can continue the discussion offline. I want to thank Daniel and Raquel for taking the time to attend this presentation. I did see one piece in the chat. Again, if you cycle all the way to the top of the chat, the CM credit number is 9221234. And you should be able to find the CM credit information on the planning.org website as well. Thank you everybody for attending, and I hope you have a wonderful Wednesday.
All right.